The air was thick with smoke, suffocating and heavy, choking everything it touched. Buildings burned, and the streets were filled with chaos, panicked footsteps, blaring sirens, and desperate cries for help echoed through the crumbling city. The fire had consumed nearly an entire block, roaring like a beast, swallowing homes and businesses alike without mercy. People ran in every direction, their faces smeared with soot, their eyes wide with fear. The heat was unbearable, radiating off the flames in waves, distorting everything in sight like a nightmare brought to life. Fire trucks lined the street, their flashing lights cutting through the smoke, illuminating the devastation. Firefighters rushed to contain the inferno, their movements swift but calculated. Water sprayed from hoses, hissing as it met the flames, but it barely made a dent. The fire was winning, growing stronger by the second, fueled by the dry summer wind and decades-old buildings made of wood that ignited like kindling. Among the chaos, a single figure moved with unwavering purpose, clad in heavy turnout gear, his helmet slightly askew but his steps steady. The human firefighter advanced toward the heart of the blaze. His name was Daniel Hayes, a seasoned firefighter with years of experience. But none of that mattered right now. All that mattered was the burning apartment complex in front of him and the knowledge that people were still trapped inside. He paused for a moment, scanning the building. The top floors were engulfed in flames, windows shattering from the heat, glass raining down onto the street below. Smoke billowed from every opening, thick and black, a toxic cloud that blotted out the sun. The evacuation order had already been given, and most of the residents had made it out. But not all. A mother had frantically screamed that her children were still upstairs. An elderly couple hadn't been seen coming out. Others might still be trapped, unable to find their way through the thick smoke and collapsing hallways. Daniel knew the risks. Entering a burning building at this stage was practically suicide. The structure could collapse at any moment, weakened by the relentless heat. But he also knew that if he didn't go in, those people wouldn't stand a chance. So, without hesitation, he tightened the straps on his oxygen mask, adjusted his helmet, and charged in. Inside, it was hell. The air was unbreathable, even through the mask, and the heat pressed against him like a physical force. Visibility was almost zero. The thick smoke reduced everything to a swirling, suffocating gray. The roar of the fire was deafening, punctuated by the occasional crash as parts of the ceiling gave way. The floor beneath his boots groaned ominously, threatening to give out at any moment. He moved quickly but carefully, navigating through the labyrinth of burning hallways. His flashlight cut through the smoke in a narrow beam, revealing glimpses of the devastation: a charred staircase, a collapsed section of ceiling, furniture reduced to smoldering rubble. He called out as he moved, his voice muffled by the mask but still strong and commanding. No answer. His heartbeat thundered in his ears, but he pressed on. On the second floor, he found them, a family of 4 huddled in a corner, their faces pale with fear, their eyes red and watering from the smoke. The mother clutched her youngest child to her chest, while the father tried in vain to cover them with his jacket. They were trapped, surrounded by flames on all sides, with no way out. Daniel didn't hesitate. He gestured for them to follow, his movements calm and deliberate despite the chaos around them. He knew panic would only make things worse. He guided them through the hallway, keeping low to avoid the worst of the smoke. The children coughed and cried, but they kept moving, clinging to their parents and to him as if their lives depended on it, because they did. The stairs were a nightmare. Half of them had collapsed, and the rest were barely holding together. Daniel tested each step before putting his weight on it, every second feeling like an eternity. The fire roared around them, the heat searing, but they kept moving, one step at a time. Finally, they burst out into the open air, Coughing and gasping for breath, the family collapsed onto the pavement, tears streaming down their faces, but they were alive. Around them, paramedics rushed in, wrapping the children in blankets, checking their vitals, reassuring them that they were safe now. Daniel didn't stop. There were still others inside. He went back in twice more, each time emerging with more survivors: an elderly woman barely able to walk, a young man who had passed out from the smoke, a teenage girl clinging to her dog. Each time, he pushed himself harder, ignoring the burning in his lungs and the ache in his muscles. The building groaned and shifted, each trip more dangerous than the last, but he didn't stop until he was sure no one was left behind. When he finally emerged for the last time, the crowd that had gathered outside erupted into applause. Strangers reached out to pat him on the back, their faces a mix of gratitude and awe. His fellow firefighters clapped him on the shoulder, their eyes filled with respect. He was drenched in sweat, his gear covered in soot, his body screaming in protest, but he stood tall. The fire had taken a lot that day: homes, memories, pieces of people's lives that could never be replaced. But it hadn't taken everything. Thanks to him, every soul inside that building had made it out alive. Daniel took a deep breath, the cool air a stark contrast to the inferno he had just left behind. For a moment, he allowed himself to feel the weight of what had happened, the enormity of it all. Then, with a tired but determined smile, he turned back toward his crew, ready for whatever came next. The fire was out, but the job was never done. The building groaned under its own weight, fire consuming every floor like a beast unleashed. Thick black smoke poured out of shattered windows, curling into the night sky. Sirens wailed in the distance, but they felt like faint echoes amid the chaos. People stumbled out of the entrance, faces smeared with soot, eyes wide with fear. The once proud office tower was now a crumbling inferno, barely holding together. Fire danced across its surface, gnawing at steel and glass with merciless hunger. Crowds gathered at a distance, held back by police barricades and the overwhelming heat radiating from the blaze. Mothers clutched their children close. Fathers looked on helplessly, scanning for loved ones. There was no control, no order, just panic. Emergency responders tried their best to maintain some sense of calm. Medics worked quickly, treating burns and smoke inhalation, their gloves stained with soot and blood. Firefighters sprayed water into the flames, but it barely seemed to make a dent. The blaze was too fierce, too far gone. It looked like the building would collapse at any moment, and everyone knew it. The only option was to contain the fire and keep it from spreading. And then, amid the chaos, one figure stood out, a human firefighter, gear blackened by soot, sweat soaking through his uniform, stood at the edge of the collapsing structure. His breathing mask hung loosely around his neck. His face was lined with grime, but his eyes were calm, focused. Where others hesitated, he moved forward without a second thought. The firefighter's name was David. He was no superhero, no larger-than-life figure. He was just a man doing his job, a job that most would never dare to do. This wasn't his first fire. He had seen dozens over the years, each with its own horrors. But tonight was different. Tonight, the fire wasn't just consuming a building, it was threatening to take more lives. Word spread through the crowd: there were still people inside. A family trapped on the upper floors, too high for ladders to reach, too far gone for the aerial unit to make a rescue in time. The fire had cut off the stairwell, and the elevator shafts had collapsed early on. They had no way out. David knew the odds. He had been trained to calculate risks, to balance bravery with survival. Every instinct told him this was suicide. The structure was failing, the heat intense enough to melt steel, But none of that mattered, not when lives were on the line. He tightened his mask, adjusted his helmet, and stepped into the burning building. The heat hit him like a wall, fierce and suffocating. Flames crackled and hissed around him, licking at his boots and gloves. Visibility was near zero, the smoke so thick it felt like trying to breathe through wet cement. His oxygen tank hissed softly with each breath, a constant reminder of how little time he had. He moved quickly but carefully, testing each step before putting his weight down. The floor creaked ominously beneath him, the wood weakened by the fire. He could hear the groaning of steel beams bending under the heat. Time was running out. He climbed the stairs 2 at a time, his boots thudding against the steps. His flashlight cut through the smoke, illuminating twisted metal and fallen debris. When he reached the 14th floor, the air was hotter, thicker. Flames had swallowed half the hallway, reducing doors to blackened husks. He shouted into the void, hoping for some sign of life. A faint cry answered him, barely audible over the roar of the fire. He followed the sound, weaving through the debris. There they were, huddled in a corner, a mother clutching her 2 children, shielding them from the heat. Their faces were pale, eyes wide with terror. The mother's lips moved, but no sound came out. Her strength was nearly gone. David moved quickly. He grabbed the smallest child first, wrapping them in his fire-resistant jacket, shielding them from the heat. He lifted the second child into his arms, nodding to the mother, signaling her to stay close. They moved as fast as they could, weaving through the burning maze. The floor groaned beneath them, sections of it collapsing just seconds after they passed. His muscles burned with the effort, lungs screaming for clean air. But he kept going. Every step was a battle, every breath a victory. When they reached the stairwell, part of it had collapsed. He had no choice but to carry them down the remaining flights, one by one. The mother stumbled but caught herself, determination burning in her eyes despite her exhaustion. The ground floor was chaos, flames licking at the walls, smoke pouring in from every corner. But the exit was in sight. David pushed forward, shielding the children as best he could. His oxygen supply was almost gone, each breath a struggle. Finally, they burst out into the night air, stumbling into the arms of waiting paramedics. The crowd gasped, then erupted into cheers. Medics rushed to the family, checking them for injuries. The mother sobbed in relief, clutching her children tightly. David leaned against a fire truck, sucking in deep gulps of fresh air, his vision blurred from the heat and exhaustion. But he smiled faintly. The family was safe. The fire still raged behind him, but in that moment, none of it mattered. He had done what he came to do. He wasn't a hero, just a man who refused to give up when it mattered most. Amid the chaos, he had stood brave, not for glory, not for recognition, but because it was the right thing to do. And that was enough. The heat was unbearable. Flames roared, devouring everything in their path as black smoke billowed into the sky. The warehouse, once a place of organized chaos with forklifts zipping between shelves stacked high with goods, was now an inferno. It groaned under the pressure of the flames, the steel beams bending as the structure threatened to collapse at any moment. Debris rained down like fiery hailstones, and the air itself seemed to pulse with the angry crackle of fire. The evacuation sirens had blared minutes earlier, cutting through the noise of the fire, urging everyone to flee. Workers sprinted out, coughing and choking as they pushed through thick clouds of smoke, their eyes burning and lungs screaming for clean air. Outside, the emergency services were scrambling to take control. Fire engines lined the street, red lights flashing wildly, sirens screaming intermittently. Firefighters moved with practiced efficiency, unraveling hoses and barking orders at each other. Among them stood a man whose uniform was blackened with soot, his face smeared with ash, but his eyes were sharp and focused. His name was Lieutenant John Harris, a veteran firefighter with over 2 decades of experience. He had seen fires consume entire buildings before, but this one was different. It wasn't just about putting out the flames, it was about saving lives. When he arrived, the situation was already dire. The fire had spread too fast, too aggressively. It had started in the storage section where flammable chemicals were stored, a disaster waiting to happen. An explosion had rocked the building, and within moments, the flames were out of control. The other firefighters focused on containing the fire from the outside. The roof looked like it could collapse at any moment, and it was far too dangerous to send anyone back inside. No one would survive in there, they said. The fire was too intense, the smoke too thick. But then came the shout from the back of the crowd, a worker screaming, frantic and hoarse. His co-worker was still inside. John didn't hesitate. He tightened the straps of his oxygen mask, adjusted his helmet, and pushed past the others without a word. His colleagues tried to stop him, grabbing his arm, warning him that it was suicide. But John shrugged them off. There was someone in there, a human life hanging by a thread, and that was all that mattered. The heat hit him like a wall as he entered the building, the flames hungrily licking at the walls around him. His breathing was loud and steady inside the mask, the only sound besides the crackling of the fire and the occasional groan of the collapsing structure. Visibility was almost zero, the smoke so thick it felt like he was wading through darkness. He moved methodically, his eyes scanning for any sign of life. His boots crunched over broken glass and twisted metal as he made his way deeper into the warehouse. Every step was a risk. The floor was weakened by the fire, and one wrong move could send him plunging into the burning wreckage below. His flashlight beam cut through the smoke, illuminating fragments of the chaos around him: overturned shelves, scorched pallets, and smoldering debris. Then he heard it, a faint, desperate sound, a cough. John turned toward the sound, his heart pounding. He moved faster now, ignoring the heat, ignoring the danger. The coughing grew louder as he got closer. Finally, through the haze, he saw him, a man curled up behind a metal support beam, his face pale and streaked with soot, his clothes singed. He was barely conscious, gasping for air. John crouched beside him, checking for injuries. The man's eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, there was only fear. But when he saw John, something changed. Relief washed over his face, and he tried to speak, but no words came out. Without wasting time, John hauled him to his feet, wrapping an arm around his waist to support him. The man was weak, his legs barely able to hold his weight, but John kept him moving, one step at a time. The way back felt twice as long, every second stretching into an eternity. The fire seemed angrier now, the flames closing in from all sides. Beams fell from the ceiling, crashing to the ground in showers of sparks. John didn't stop. His focus was unbreakable, one step at a time. Just keep moving. The exit was in sight now, the cool night air just beyond the wall of smoke. John could hear the voices of his team outside, shouting his name, urging him on. With a final surge of strength, he pushed through the smoke and stumbled out into the open. Fresh air flooded his lungs, and the man beside him collapsed into the waiting arms of paramedics. John took a step back, hands on his knees, breathing hard. The cool air felt almost foreign after the heat inside. Around him, the scene was chaotic, paramedics working, firefighters still battling the blaze, but there was a sense of relief in the air. He straightened, pulling off his helmet. His face was streaked with sweat and soot, his eyes red from the smoke, but there was a calmness about him. He watched as the man he had just rescued was loaded into an ambulance, the doors closing behind him. The fire still raged, but it was under control now. The danger had passed. John stood there for a moment, taking it all in. He had done what needed to be done, just like he always did. There was no celebration, no fanfare, just another life saved, another job done. As he turned to rejoin his team, the flames crackling behind him, one thing was clear: no matter how bad it got, no matter how impossible it seemed, there would always be someone willing to walk into the fire, someone who refused to cower in fear. And tonight, that someone had been him. The city burned with a fury no one had expected. It wasn't a simple fire. It was a full-scale disaster. A chain reaction of explosions that started in a chemical storage facility on the industrial outskirts. Within minutes, flames had raced through surrounding neighborhoods. The night sky glowed an angry red, smoke rising in thick columns, choking everything in its path. Sirens screamed from every direction. Streets that had once buzzed with life were now crowded with fleeing people, families clutching children, pets tucked under arms, and belongings hastily stuffed into bags. Most had never seen anything like it. Even the seasoned emergency responders froze in shock at the scale of destruction. The heat was unbearable, turning the streets into an oven. Cars left abandoned by their owners melted under the blaze, their metal frames twisting into grotesque shapes. The air smelled of burning rubber, scorched wood, and something metallic and harsh. Through it all, one figure kept moving toward the fire instead of away from it, dressed in a soot-streaked uniform, his helmet visor cracked, his breathing mask hanging loosely around his neck. The human firefighter pushed forward. His name was John, but no one had time to think about names in moments like these. To the panicked eyes watching him, he was just the firefighter, unshaken, unyielding, and determined in the face of hell. John didn't waste time. He assessed the situation with calm efficiency that only years of training and raw human grit could provide. The blaze was spreading faster than any containment team could handle. Buildings collapsed into themselves in fiery implosions, the heat from their fall radiating outward like a furnace blast. John knew exactly what was at stake. He had seen disasters before, but nothing like this. This was different. People were still trapped in some of those buildings, elderly residents who couldn't move fast enough, families huddled in top-floor apartments, and workers caught in the sudden eruption of flames in the industrial district. He adjusted his oxygen mask, securing it tightly. His heartbeat drummed in his ears, but he pushed the sound aside, focused entirely on the task ahead. His boots pounded against the pavement as he made his way to a collapsed apartment building. The fire roared around it like a living thing, consuming everything it touched. A lesser person would have turned back. John forced his way inside, stepping over fallen beams and broken glass. His flashlight cut through the swirling smoke. Every breath was a fight against the suffocating heat. His eyes stung from the smoke, and the sweat pouring down his face made it almost impossible to see. He found an elderly woman first, curled in a corner beneath a blanket soaked in soot. She was barely conscious, coughing weakly. Without hesitation, John scooped her up, cradling her against his chest as he navigated the crumbling structure. Every step was a calculated risk. Floorboards threatened to give way, and chunks of the ceiling crashed down with terrifying regularity. Outside, he handed her off to paramedics before disappearing back into the inferno without a word. There was no time to rest. The second rescue was harder. A young boy had been trapped on the third floor, his cries barely audible over the roar of the flames. John climbed what was left of the stairwell, the heat nearly unbearable at that height. His muscles screamed in protest, but he pushed on. He found the boy huddled behind an overturned table, his face streaked with tears and soot. John wrapped the child in his fire-resistant jacket, shielding him from the worst of the heat as they made their way back down. The building groaned ominously around them, and John knew they had seconds, maybe less. They burst through the front entrance just as the roof caved in behind them, sending a plume of sparks and debris into the air. The crowd cheered when they saw him emerge, the boy clinging to his neck. John didn't acknowledge them. He handed the boy to his waiting parents and turned back toward the fire again. He didn't stop. He couldn't stop. More lives were still in danger. It wasn't bravery. Not really. John didn't think of it that way. It was his job, his duty, something he had trained for, something that had been ingrained in him from the first day he put on the uniform. Hours passed like this, each rescue blurred into the next, a relentless push against the raging fire. He moved on pure instinct, driven by nothing more than the need to keep going, to keep pulling people out until there was no one left. His lungs burned. His limbs felt like lead, and still, he refused to give in. Eventually, the fire began to lose its grip on the city. Reinforcements had arrived, and the containment lines held. Exhausted firefighters collapsed onto the pavement, their faces blackened with soot, their bodies trembling from the strain. John stood among them, his chest heaving, sweat pouring down his face. His eyes scanned the wreckage one last time. The chaos had finally begun to fade. The fire was dying, beaten back by the collective effort of the brave men and women who had refused to let it win. But everyone knew the tide had turned because of him, the one who had stepped forward when no one else dared, the one who had made the first move into the heart of the blaze. John didn't seek recognition. He never did. As the paramedics tended to him, and the last flames were extinguished, he quietly walked away, disappearing into the smoky dawn. For the people of the city, however, his actions would never be forgotten. Amid the chaos, only the human firefighter had stood brave, and in that moment, his courage had made all the difference.